You are standing in a shallow trench on the bank of the Nile in northern Sudan. The year is 1964. The wind is carrying sand off the desert, and the sky is the color of old linen. Someone hands you a trowel. Handle first, like a key. You scrape away a layer of dry earth, and under it, you find a ribcage. The bones are not white. They are stained brown, like tea left in a cup too long. Next to the ribcage, there is a narrow piece of flint, sharp enough to catch the light. It is sitting exactly where a hip would be. That is how archaeologists found the first evidence of something people still argue about. The First War. The place has a catalogue name now. Site 117, Jebel Sahaba, a cemetery in northern Sudan, a few kilometers from the old Nile. When the team led by Fred Wendorf pulled those bones out of the ground, nobody expected them to change the story of human violence. They were looking for ancient settlements, hearths, and pottery. What they found instead was a graveyard where the dead had been hit, stabbed, and sometimes killed by stone points. Here is the promise of this video. You are going to meet three things: a stone point stuck near a spine, a person who survived an attack and lived with the scar, and a cemetery where the trauma keeps repeating, burial after burial. By the end, you will not think about the First War the same way again. You will probably stop asking when it started. You will start asking why it started and why it keeps starting. The standard story goes like this. Somewhere around 13,000 years ago, two groups met, fought, and one of them lost. The cemetery preserved the losers. The projectiles in their bones are the receipt. That version is clean, dramatic, and easy to explain. It is also probably wrong. Let's slow down and look at the bones the way the people who found them did. The site was excavated as part of a rescue project. The Aswan High Dam was going to flood parts of the Nile Valley, so archaeologists were racing to record everything before the water rose. Wendorf and his team were working through a huge stretch of territory, a kind of archaeological sweep before the flood. Back in 1964, they came across a small cemetery near the village of Jebel Sahaba. The cemetery was unremarkable at first. A cluster of burials, some with grave goods, some without. Then the projectiles showed up. You need to picture the field conditions. There were no DNA labs, no CT scanners, no databases of trauma patterns. The team worked in the desert with brushes, sieves, and paper bags. Every skeleton was a puzzle made of fragments, and still, the pattern was hard to miss. Stone points kept turning up in the wrong places, inside bodies, under ribs, next to spines. The first analysts, Anderson and Butler, took a closer look at the skeletons. They found injuries that were not from digging, not from animals, not from the slow collapse of old bones. They found wounds that matched stone points. Some points were still embedded in the skeleton or lying in the fill where the body had been placed. At least half of the people in that cemetery showed signs of violence. For the 1960s, that was a bombshell. Think about what that means for a moment. You are looking at a cemetery, not a mass grave. People were buried carefully. There were no signs of hurried disposal, yet many of them had been shot or stabbed before they died. That is a strange combination. If there had been one terrible battle, you might expect a pile of bodies. Instead, you get a community that buried its dead properly, and those dead carried the marks of repeated attacks. That is the first clue that the story is more complicated. Here is the thing. Bones do not lie, but they do not talk either. You have to ask the right questions. Before we go further, let's talk about what a projectile wound actually looks like on a bone. Stone does not slice the way metal does. A flint point is hard and sharp, but it also fractures when it hits something solid. When it enters a body, it can leave a channel, a groove, a notch, or a puncture. That is why archaeologists find pieces of flint in burials at all. If the point had been removed cleanly, we might never know it was there. The shape of the wound tells you something about speed. A slow thrust leaves a different mark than a fast shot. A thrown spear carries less velocity than a bow shot, so its entry wound tends to be messier. A bow shot can drive a point deep enough to lodge in bone. The team that re-examined the cemetery looked for exactly those differences, and they found both kinds. That detail matters because it tells us the people at Jebel Sahaba were not all killed the same way. Some wounds look like close combat. Some look like ambushes from a distance. Some bodies have multiple injuries, as if the attacker kept going after the person fell. Others have one clean wound, as if the fight ended quickly. The location of the wound matters too. A point in the front of the skull means you saw it coming. A point in the back means you did not. A point in the arm means you raised a hand to protect yourself. Archaeologists can map these locations the way a detective maps a crime scene. The map at Jebel Sahaba is not tidy. It looks like real violence, not a staged tableau. Real violence is messy. It leaves bruises, breaks, and bad memories. The bones preserve the mess. Now, a confession about archaeology. We do not know exactly how long the cemetery was used. The dating of Jebel Sahaba is not as precise as we would like. Radiocarbon dates put the site somewhere in the late Pleistocene, broadly around 13,000 years ago, but the margins are wider than a headline. Some researchers have argued for an older date, some for a slightly younger one. The people who worked there in the 1960s did not have the dating methods we have now. Later studies have tried to refine the timeline, but the cemetery remains difficult to pin down. Why does that matter? Because if the burials happened over a long span, then the violence could have been spread across generations. People who died in one raid might not have known the people who died in the next. The cemetery would still look like a pattern, but the pattern would be even slower, even more dispersed, and even harder to call a single war. That is one of the reasons the 2021 reanalysis was so important. It did not just count wounds. It counted the timing of wounds the way a coroner might. Healed injuries tell you about survival. Unhealed injuries tell you about the final event. When you find both in the same body, you know that person lived through violence more than once. Let's slow down and sit with that. There is a skeleton at Jebel Sahaba that has both a healed injury and an unhealed one. We do not know that person's name. We do not know if they were a hunter, a fisher, a parent, or a child, but we know they were hurt, healed, and hurt again. That is not a statistic. That is a life. Now, the 2021 team, Isabelle Crevecoeur and colleagues at the University of Bordeaux, working with the British Museum, went through the collection one skeleton at a time. They used microscopes, radiography, and newer methods for telling old injuries from post-mortem damage. Out of 61 individuals, 41 had at least one healed or unhealed injury. That is about 2/3 of the cemetery. Around half of the injuries were consistent with projectile weapons, which means arrows or thrown spears. That changes the picture completely. Same bones, new eyes. The old version of the story treated Jebel Sahaba as a single massacre, one terrible day when everyone in the cemetery died together. The new analysis says no, the injuries happened at different times. People survived between attacks. The violence went on for years, maybe decades. It was not a battle. It was a long, grinding pattern of raids, ambushes, and fights that kept coming back to the same group. Now, we have to ask the obvious question. Why? Here is where archaeology gets uncomfortable. The people at Jebel Sahaba lived at the end of the late Pleistocene. The world around them was not stable. The Nile was changing, climate was shifting, and resources were becoming harder to predict. Crevecoeur and colleagues suggested that the violence may have been tied to environmental stress. When the river moved, when the fish changed, when the floodplain shrank, the people who depended on it had to make hard choices. Some of those choices involved other people. Let us make sure we understand the evidence correctly. The researchers did not say that climate caused every wound. They said that the pattern of violence, spread out over time, fits a world under pressure. You do not get a single glorious battle from that kind of stress. You get years of small wars, the kind that never make a chronicle because there is no one left to write it down. The really disturbing part is how ordinary the injuries are. Here is the part I cannot shake. That person was somebody. Somebody with a name. Somebody with plans. Take one of the people buried with a healed wound. Imagine living through an arrow strike to the shoulder or a spear wound to the arm. The bone knitted. The person went back to fishing, gathering, raising children, whatever their life looked like. Then, years later, another attack happened. Maybe this time they did not survive. The skeleton tells both stories at once. It survived, and then it did not. That is not the signature of a war. It is the signature of a feud, a siege, a slow emergency. Now let's talk about a word we keep using without checking it. War. Researchers have spent a lot of time arguing about whether Jebel Sahaba is evidence of war or just evidence of violence. Some say the scale is too small for war. Some say the injuries are mostly interpersonal, not intergroup. Others say the distinction does not matter much when you are looking at a cemetery where 2/3 of the dead have been hurt. The distinction does matter, though, because it changes the story we tell ourselves about the past. If Jebel Sahaba was a feud between families, then early violence looks personal. It looks like a cycle of revenge, not an organized conflict. If it was a series of raids between groups, then early violence looks political. It looks like competition over territory, resources, and survival. The same bones can support both readings. The interpretation depends on how much weight you give to the healed wounds, the timing, and the surrounding environment. That is why the study of early war is so hard. You are trying to reconstruct politics from injuries. The 2021 team chose to describe the site as evidence of repeated small-scale conflict that may have been connected to environmental stress. They did not call it the first war in a grand headline. They left room for doubt. That is not weakness. That is the field working properly. Call it what you want. The wounds are real. There is a broader pattern in the archaeology of violence that you should know about. When researchers look at prehistoric cemeteries, they do not find one tidy origin story, they find a patchwork. Some communities show almost no violence. Others show a few injuries. A smaller number show the kind of repeated trauma seen at Jebel Sahaba. There is no universal human tendency toward war and no universal innocence. Either, there are conditions that make violence more likely and conditions that make it less likely. The environment at Jebel Sahaba may have been one of those conditions. The Nile was not a stable highway. It shifted, flooded, and dried. A community that depended on the river would have felt every change. When food becomes scarce, groups sometimes turn against each other. That does not excuse violence, but it does explain it. It also means that the first wars were probably not fought for glory. They were fought for the same reasons most wars are fought: access, fear, and the feeling that there is not enough to go around. You have probably heard someone say that violence is in our nature. Jebel Sahaba does not prove that. It proves that violence can happen early, under pressure, in ways that leave marks on bone. That is a different claim. Our nature is not one thing. It is a set of possibilities, and circumstances decide which ones get used. Here is another thing the cemetery teaches us. The survivors matter. Every cemetery is a record of the dead, but Jebel Sahaba is also a record of the living, the people who buried the wounded, who mourned the dead, and who stayed together long enough to create a cemetery were making a choice. They chose to maintain a community, even while violence was tearing through it. That is not a footnote. That is the other half of the story. When you read about ancient violence, you usually hear about the people who died. The survivors are quieter. They carried scars, tended the wounded, and rebuilt. Jebel Sahaba is their archive too. There is another famous site that makes the same point. Back in 2016, a team led by Marta Mirazanlar published evidence from Natarak in Kenya, a burial ground from around 10,000 years ago. There, too, the dead showed signs of group violence, including what looked like bound hands. The site is not the same as Jebel Sahaba. The date is not the same, but the pattern is familiar. Early collective violence appears in different places at different times, and it always looks messy. That is why the question, "What was the first war?" is a little bit like asking, "What was the first language?" or "What was the first family?" The answer depends on how you define the word. If you define war as two armies meeting on a field, then Jebel Sahaba is not even close. If you define it as organized, repeated violence between groups, then the cemetery is one of the earliest doors we have. We love clean origins. The past does not cooperate. Maybe the first war had no name at all. Maybe it was just a bad year, then another bad year, then a habit. Let's look at one more layer of evidence, the one that makes archaeologists argue. The stone points at Jebel Sahaba were not all the same. Some look like arrowheads, some look like spear points, some are small enough that they might have been barbs. That variety suggests the people had a range of weapons, not just one kind. It also makes it hard to say exactly how the injuries happened. A point could have been thrown, shot, or thrust. The wound shape can narrow it down, but it cannot always give you the final answer. Sometimes the answer is a question. This is the honest part of archaeology. We do not know who attacked these people or why or how many attackers there were. We do not know if the violence came from one neighboring group or several. We do not even know if the cemetery represents a whole community or just part of it. The skeleton is the evidence, but the story is still under construction. That is honest. That is science. And yet, some things are solid. The projectiles are real. The healed wounds are real. The dates are broadly agreed. The pattern of repeated violence is now backed by microscopic analysis. That may be more important than knowing the exact name of the war, because it tells us how early people learned to treat other people as problems. There is another reason this cemetery became famous, and it has nothing to do with blood. It is one of the few prehistoric sites where the dead were studied by so many different generations of researchers. The original excavators recorded what they could in the 1960s, and Wendorf published the results in the Prehistory of Nubia in 1968. Later, teams added new methods. The British Museum and the University of Bordeaux brought the collection back into the light in the 21st century. Each pass changed the story a little. The bones did not change. The questions did. That is the real lesson of Jebel Sahaba. The evidence is fixed. The interpretation is not. When Crevecoeur and colleagues published their reanalysis, they did not just find new wounds. They found that some old assumptions were built on a smaller sample. A point found in the fill of a grave is not the same as a point embedded in bone. A healed injury is not the same as a fatal one. The new work forced archaeologists to be more careful about what they call evidence of war. And that is why the answer to what was the first war keeps moving. Every new method gives us a sharper view of the old bones. Maybe the next scan will reveal something nobody has noticed. Maybe a new dating technique will shift the timeline. The story is not finished, and that is exactly what makes archaeology worth watching. Think about how much of our history is written this way. Someone finds something, builds a story, and the story stays for decades until better tools arrive. Jebel Sahaba is not unique. It is just a perfect example of science doing its slow, annoying job. Modern warfare looks different on the surface. It has drones, treaties, borders, and news broadcasts. But underneath, it still runs on the same machinery. People dividing themselves into us and them. People deciding that someone else can be hurt. People turning a slow emergency into a habit. Jebel Sahaba is 13,000 years old, and the pattern is still running today. And growing. The weapons changed. The arithmetic did not. Someone still decides that another group can be crossed off the map. Let's go back to the trench one last time. You are standing there in 1964, holding the trowel. You have just exposed a rib cage, and a piece of flint. At the time, you do not know that this cemetery will be studied for the next 60 years. You do not know that microscopes will eventually reveal scars you cannot see with your eyes. You only know that the bones look wrong and the flint looks too deliberate to be an accident. That is how the First War was found. Not by a general, not by a chronicler, not by a hero. It was found by people who were willing to get their hands dirty, to count the wounds, and to ask what the bones were trying to say. The flint in the hip did not announce itself. It waited 60 years for someone to ask the right question. The answer is still uncomfortable. War is not a special event that happened once. It is a habit that grew out of ordinary decisions: who belongs, who does not, who gets the river, who gets the sand. The people at Jebel Sahaba did not invent the habit. They just left us the receipt. It was never about one tribe being worse than another. It was about what pressure does to people. So what should you take away from a cemetery full of stone points? Maybe this: the First War was not found in a battle plan or a declaration. It was found in a hip bone, a healed shoulder, and a grave that kept getting revisited. The flint point is still sharp. The choice it represents is still with us. War is older than its name, and you do not need a battlefield to see it. Sometimes a trowel is enough.